You're probably familiar with how patterns are typically digitized for 2D CAD software. Maybe you've had access to this equipment at university or through a job, but I don't know any individual that has access to digitizing equipment on their own. I'm going to show you an accessible way to digitize patterns with your phone that's pretty unglamorous, but how to do it accurately using just Photoshop and CLO. Starting with the things you'll need, let's take a look at my setup here. The first thing I'll recommend is placing your patterns on some kind of gridded background. Ideally, that would mean one of those gridded cutting mats, but if you don't have that, you can use the lines of a hardwood floor or the grid of a tile floor. Here you can see I've used my hardwood floors. The next thing you'll notice is I've drawn grain lines on my patterns. Now I'm digitizing a deconstructed garment here, so what I recommend is a chalk wheel. Here I'm using this clover one that looks kind of like a lipstick. If you're digitizing paper patterns, I highly recommend using the standard gridded pattern paper and drawing your grain lines along the grid. You'll want to use that same method of chalk or pen or pencil to mark out any things like darts or flies that you might need. You also want to mark a square on your pattern that you know the dimensions of. So here I've marked a 2 by 2 inch square. Some things you might not see from this image is I've ironed my patterns really well. You can and should iron your pattern paper if it's wrinkled, but be sure not to use steam. I've also taped down areas of the pattern that aren't lying flat. For this, you could also use pattern weights or a combination of the two. Here's what to think about when taking your photo. Try to hold the camera flat and directly above your patterns. It's never going to be perfect without a camera mount, but I'm trying to show you the best way to do this without all that extra equipment. We're going to fix any distortions in Photoshop after this. Do your best to line your grain lines up with whatever grid you're using in the background. Make sure you have both horizontal and vertical markings on all 4 sides of your image. This is something I noticed after the fact that I should have done better in having a vertical line in my grid on the left side of my image. Make sure these are as long and easy to see as possible. So in the future, I would have moved my patterns over to expose the vertical line that's touching my pattern a little bit better, and also to see the next line in the wood. The last thing I'll say about taking your photo is it's a bit of a toss-up on how many patterns to cram into one photo. If everything is in one photo and you have minor scaling issues, it means that everything will be off by the same amount. However, if you try to cram too many patterns into one image, it can actually cause distortion issues if the surface area of the image you're trying to take becomes too large. I'm going to show you 2 ways in Photoshop to fix perspective issues on your image. If you skip this step, your patterns will be distorted and you'll measure your traced out pattern and realize that it doesn't quite match your real pattern. So definitely use one of these 2 methods. When you open an image in Photoshop, you'll see here in the layers panel, it will be called background. I'm going to right click on it and convert it to a smart object. Then I'm going to go up here to the filter menu and choose camera raw filter. Click this arrow to drop down the geometry tab. Then select the last icon on the far right. You're going to click down to place these lines along the vertical lines of your grid. You can easily adjust the anchor points after you place them to get them better in line with the lines of your grid. I could follow this vertical marking here, but you're only going to be able to place 2 vertical and 2 horizontal markings, and you want to make sure they're on either sides of your image. So I'm going to have to use this tiny little line up here at the top. Now I know to pay better attention to the lines of my grid when taking my photo so that I have a better line to work from. I'm just going to do the best I can with this line. You'll see the photo adjusts after each line that you place. Now you can see my vertical line up here is actually outside my image. Now I'm going to place my 2 horizontal lines. You'll see how the image adjusts when I place my second horizontal line. When you're happy with it, you can click OK. Because we converted this to a smart object, in the layers panel, you can actually hide show this filter or double click camera raw filter and get back there to make any adjustments as needed. Now you can go to File, Save As, and name your file and save it as a JPEG. Though I recommend that you absolutely do this, I don't recommend that you spend a super long time on it. For this second method, we're just going to double click the background layer until it becomes layer 0. Then you can click and hold down your crop tool and select perspective crop tool. You're just going to marquee a box over your image. Make sure the box at the top of the screen that says Show Grid is checked on. The way this tool works is you'll individually move the four corners of your marquee box until the lines of the grid or even the outsides of the box line up with the markings you have in your background. So in my case, the hardwood floor. What you may notice is adjusting one corner can sometimes tip the whole grid and require you to adjust the opposite corner afterwards. It can also mean that lines that you previously lined up with a line in your image are now maybe slightly below or above, but as long as the lines are parallel, it's still going to be fine. When you're happy, you can click the check mark at the top of the screen. Then go to File, Save As, name your image, and save it as a JPEG. To start off with in CLO, I'm going to use my rectangle tool to create a rectangle that's generously larger than my patterns. For me, that's 35 inches wide by 50 inches tall. Then I'm going to grab my internal rectangle tool by pressing and holding the internal polygon. Remember, I told you to draw a square on your pattern that you knew the dimensions of. I'm going to draw a 2 by 2 inch square, just like I have on my physical pattern. Don't worry right now about the placement of your square. So here in a folder in my CLO library, I have 4 different versions of my pattern image. I did 2 tests of each method. I'm just going to select one to start with, and I'll drag and drop this image onto the fabric chip in my object browser. This is going to add my pattern image as the texture image of my fabric. Now I'll grab my Edit Texture tool and left click down on my pattern. At the top, you can use the rotation wheel and hold Shift if you need to rotate your image like I do. Holding Shift will lock it into that 90 and 45 degree angle. Then just click and drag to move the image around on your pattern until you can see it properly. Now I'll switch to my Transform Pattern tool and move the square that I drew to line up with the square that's drawn on my pattern. I know that my chalk line was marking around the outside of a 2 by 2 inch box, so my goal will be to line up this internal marking with the interior of the chalk mark. I had issues with my square not wanting to sit in the right place, so I actually found it easier to switch to my Edit Texture tool and move my texture instead. Basically what we're doing is evaluating how this compares to the square drawn on our garment. So obviously now we need to scale our image down so that the square on our physical garment or pattern matches the square that we've drawn. There are 2 frustrations when scaling down with the Edit Texture tool. One is if you're already pretty close to the right size, it's difficult to scale it just a small amount. And as you can see, it drastically moves the image as it scales. So I found that mine scaled too far. So what's easier to do is click on your fabric in the object browser, scroll down to Texture, and then drop down the Transformation menu. Make sure you have aspect ratio checked on, and then you can start slowly stepping down the percentage value until your squares match. So I tried going from 100% to 98, and I can see that my square is still a little bit big. So I'm going to click on my fabric tab again and try to jump down to 95%. If you have trouble seeing your square as you're moving around, you can change your 2D fabric view here to translucent. I continued to adjust the amount in smaller and smaller increments until I was pretty happy with it at 93%. For the purposes of this video, I then copy-pasted my pattern and added all 4 of my test images just so that I could compare and find out which method worked the best. So I just repeat the exact same process with each one to scale the image. You'll see that this has been taken a little bit out of order of the video, so I have actually already traced out one of my backs on the first pattern. But what that's done has allowed me to see how the images have been different and how some are longer or shorter than others. For me, this perspective crop test 1 came out the closest. I'm not suggesting that you have to do this many tests. Any of these images could have worked, and sometimes Camera Raw Filter might work better. They're all close enough that how we edit it in the next section will apply to any of them. So how did I know which image was the most accurate? I measured. So we're going to do that now by measuring our pattern. First, we need to grab our internal Polygon tool and we're going to trace our pattern out. front. So the back I traced in sections. For some reason, I just completed each segment separately. You don't need to do that, but it's also fine if you want to. Remember to hold shift and make things like your hem straight, whether or not the pattern looks that way, especially if you're doing a garment like I did where things get distorted in the sewing. Feel free to clean up your hand-drawn lines or raw cut fabric to fix things that you know aren't accurate. With internal Polygon, you left click to add a segment point and hold Control when you click to add a curve point, and double click to end the line. What I did to decide which image was the closest to my real garment was first I traced out the entire back panel. Then with edit pattern, I began measuring things. So outseam, inseam, and rise helped me determine the discrepancy in the total height or length of the pattern. The waist and the hem will help you determine the discrepancy in the pattern width. So my first image that I traced out was nearly an inch too long in the total length. So with this image here, you can see that previously traced out pattern is a lot longer than my image. That's how I determined this one. When I checked the widths, they were like pretty close, and the lengths were a lot closer than any of the other ones. So what I'm doing here is adjusting the traced out markings from my first image to match this image that I think is the most accurate. I then traced out my front pattern as well. If you wanted to try more than one type of image and see which one was the best, you may want to trace out both the front and the back, or all of your patterns, because the distortion can happen differently on the different patterns based on the angle you take the photo. You may want to double check these things beforehand. I was pretty confident that this image was going to work and I would make minor adjustments as needed. So you'll see here I'm just double checking the measurements on my front and back to make sure that any discrepancies are similar between the two, so that when I make my adjustments I'll make them to both patterns. So I've gotten rid of all the patterns and images that I'm not proceeding with, and you may only have had this one to begin with anyway. Now we're going to grab our trace tool, and holding shift, we're going to select all the outlines of the pattern. You can actually do all your patterns at once if you want, and right click on one of the lines and choose trace as pattern. Just left click in the 2D background to place them down. While they're selected in the object browser, you can click the assign button and it will just assign them to their own new default fabric. Now you can delete that box we used for scaling, and now I'll show you how I fixed some of the discrepancies I had with my pattern. If you watch Photoshop tutorials on those two methods I showed you, they'll show you other methods in Photoshop for fixing distortion with length or width. But there's no way to do that really accurately within Photoshop, which is why I don't spend a lot of time in there. I think it's better once you're at this stage to do it all with measurements and just pattern adjustments. So with a length issue, whether it's too short or too long, you'll want to slash the pattern open in a couple of places. So with internal Polygon, I draw a line straight across from my outseam to kind of the middle of my back rise, and I right click and cut it. So if your garment is too short in length, you'll want to add here. With edit pattern, you're going to right click and offset pattern outline. So you want to divide up the total amount between the rise and the lower leg, and probably maybe even a little bit more in the lower leg. In this example, you'll see I'm adding 0.444 inches here. So I offset the pattern outline by half that amount on each side. So 0.222, and I select extend in the drop down menu. Then you'll want to merge the pattern back together at these two lines, but you need them to match. So the easiest way I find to do that is select both lines, right click, and match up to center. Then I just click and drag these points holding shift and do my best to eyeball splitting the difference here. Once you do the first one, the other one will snap to the first point. I do this on both sides, and then I select both lines and right click and merge the patterns together. So there's going to be this little jagged area where you merge these together, but you can kind of true it up later by converting all these segment points to curve points and removing excess curve points. So basically the same way that you would true this up with flat pattern making. So alternatively, if like me, you actually need to reduce your pattern here, when you select offset pattern outline, you're actually going to choose retract from the drop down menu and then enter in your amount. You can see I'm doing both sides of my pattern at the same time, which is great. Then in order to match these two segments, I actually use the change length function. I just chose the shorter segment to change because I didn't want to take away any of my hip volume. So I just right click and choose change length and selected both under the drop down menu and just entered in the total length that I wanted, which would match the other segment. Then just select both segments and right click to merge them. You'll see I use the same method on the lower portion of the leg. So my total amount in length that I want to change is divided up across at least 2 lines. You may decide you want to evenly split this into thirds, but I made my decision based on how off my rise was, and that was about half of my total amount. So I just did half in the rise and half in the lower leg. If you've got width issues, you can use the same method, drawing one central vertical line up the middle of the pattern. But if you don't have a dart or anything conflicting, I'm going to show you a quick trick that's a lot easier than that. On my front pattern where there's no dart to contend with, I can actually use my Fullness Line Tool and run a line across the top and bottom of my patterns. And I can actually open these up evenly all the way down. You could probably just leave this as start and add it out, or you can change this to both in the drop down so that it adds evenly from the middle of the pattern. So that's what I'm choosing to do here. I'm adding a 1/2 inch at the top and bottom, pretending that my pattern was a 1/2 inch too narrow. The idea with these fixes is that we've got the general shape correct from our photo and adjusting the skew, and we just need to make sure all of our major points of measure are accurate. So you can see here that my fly shape hasn't changed. I've just opened up my pattern. You'll need to do all your basic truing up from front to back and just fitting of your pattern. And I don't go over that here, but this should get you an accurate digital representation of your physical pattern using your phone to take the photo.